The scoping rules define a scope of application of JMeter assertions, timers, configuration elements, listeners, preprocessors, and postprocessors, depending on the position in the test plan. And to continue, I created a JMeter script with a skeleton with many JMeter components to understand the order of execution. So first of all, the samplers and the logic controllers are like statements and operations in a programming language. Their scope is the exact point of the test plan where they are defined, and they can be added only under a thread group. But the other JMeter components can be added anywhere in the test plan. The JMeter assertions, timers, listeners, preprocessor, postprocessor components have the scope depending on where they are placed in the test plan. If they are placed at the top level of the test plan before the thread group, then they will impact all the samplers and controllers of the entire test plan. For example, if we check on our script, this particular constant timer, it is under the test plan. It doesn't belong to any particular thread group. So this constant timer will affect all the samplers inside our test plan. That means all the samplers for each of the thread groups. If the timer is placed under a particular thread group, then it will impact only the samplers and the controllers inside that thread group. So if we check on the thread group number 2, we have a uniform random timer. This timer will only affect the request inside the thread group 2. The same occurs with the listeners. The view results string is under the test plan. So in the view results string, we will see the requests inside each of the thread groups. However, if we check on the thread group number 1, we have another listener, the aggregate report. This report will only contain the requests inside the thread group number 1. Now, if these components, the timers, listeners, configuration elements, preprocessor, postprocessor, are placed under a logic controller that itself contains a group of samplers, then these components impact only the samplers that belong to that controller. In our script, inside the thread group number 3, we have a simple controller that contains 3 requests. It is request 1, 2, and 3. Inside this simple controller, we also have a preprocessor, but this preprocessor will be applied before each of these 3 requests. But it won't be applied to the 4th request because it is not part of the simple controller. However, this postprocessor belongs to thread group number 3, and it is outside the simple controller. So this postprocessor will be applied after each of the 4 HTTP requests. What if these elements, the timers, listeners, configuration elements, preprocessor, and postprocessor, are the child element of a sampler? Then in that case, they will only affect that particular sampler, which is the example of the request 1 of the thread group 1. If we check on this request, we have as a child an HTTP header manager. So this header manager, which contains the header content type application JSON, will only be applied to the request 1 of the thread group number 1. On a given sampler, JMeter will merge all the scopable elements and then execute the sampler. This means that the timers will be summed up and the headers will be merged, or the values will be override. This HTTP header manager contains a header which is the language English. Then, if we go back again to the HTTP request 1, we have another header manager. This means that this request will contain 2 headers, the content type and the language. What if we add a second header here for the language and we change it to Spanish? Then this request will have this header for the language. It will override the value. For the sake of script reading and debugging, we will always put the scopable elements before other samplers in that scope, although it doesn't really matter. Only samplers and controllers are executed in the order they appear in the test plan. So JMeter will first evaluate the configuration elements, then the preprocessors followed by the timers, then the samplers are going to be run and executed, following the postprocessors, assertions, and finally the listeners. So these elements may be declared in different parts of the test plan, but they will be executed in the order we just mentioned. Finally, I would like to show you an example of how the order of the elements would be when executing this test. So on the left side, we have a logical tree which contains a controller. Inside that controller, we have a post-processor 1, then a sampler 1, a sampler 2, one timer, assertion 1, preprocessor 1, second timer, and post-processor 2. So what is going to be the order of execution? If we check on the right side, we can see the actual execution. First, the preprocessor 1 is executed, then both timers, then the sampler is run, after the sampler, both post-processors, and finally the assertion. And then it will be the same for the second sampler.